More talks, but still no firm agreement on the way forward. As the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit looms closer, hopes of a comprehensive treaty are fading. As the stalemate continues, campaigners are warning the world is running out of time. This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Shiulie Ghosh. Well, we're just over a month away from the UN Climate Change Summit in Copenhagen. Top of the agenda is agreeing on a process to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Current provisions, as laid out in the Kyoto Protocol, run out in 2012. And environmentalists are deeply worried because current levels of carbon dioxide are now at their highest for more than 500,000 years. Well, in order to succeed, Copenhagen has to achieve a clear way forward on 4 key points. Deciding how much developed countries will cut emissions by 2020 and 2050, setting out how major developing nations such as China, India and Brazil will limit growth of their emissions, deciding how much richer countries will contribute to poorer ones to help them meet these goals, and detailing how that financing will be managed. But just weeks away from the conference, there's Deadlock. A final 5-day session of preliminary low-level talks have been taking place in Barcelona this week to try to end the stalemate before Copenhagen. But hopes of reaching a global climate change treaty are fading. Instead, the US now says a deal is more likely late next year. Well, John Kerry, who chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said we have to be honest in the process and deal with the realities that we don't have time in these 4 weeks to put the language together and flesh out every crossed T and dotted I of a treaty. Well, EU leaders were hoping the US would pass a bill on climate change ahead of the summit to give a boost to the talks, but that now seems unlikely after pressure from Republican senators. In an unprecedented address to the US Congress this week, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said time was running short.
We all know we have no time to lose. We need an agreement at the climate conference in December.
Well, joining us now are our guests in Marsa Alam in Egypt. Nick Nuttall, a spokesman for the United Nations Environment Programme, and in Washington, D.C., Marlo Lewis, a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Gentlemen, welcome both of you to the programme. And Nick, how much of a blow was the delay of that US climate change bill?
Well, for some people it may not be much of a surprise. I mean, some of these noises have been made over several months now, but I mean, there will be concern, genuinely. But you know, like they say in opera, it's not over till the fat lady sings, and Copenhagen hasn't started, Copenhagen hasn't ended. And you never know what will happen in these big multilateral negotiations until the final gavel is banged down.
Well, I'm liking the optimism, but it does mean that the US is unlikely to propose specific figures at Copenhagen, doesn't it? And without that, other countries like China might not come on board.
Well, you know, this is a multilateral negotiation. The United States is very, very important indeed. They're signaling that they're having some difficulties with domestic legislation, but there are many things that can be still put on the table in Copenhagen that would be considered certainly an important step forward. And we need to see what those measures that will be put on the table, those proposals, the financing, and also the issue of technology transfer will be.
Marlo, the criticism, of course, being levelled at the US is that the fact that it isn't likely to pass a climate change bill anytime soon means that it's not committed to reducing global greenhouse gas emissions.
That's correct. I think that it's highly likely that the United States Congress will not pass a climate bill before the Copenhagen conference, and that means that President Obama cannot really commit to any specific emission reduction target at Copenhagen because anything that he commits to there is only as good as the Senate's willingness to ratify it as a treaty. So if the Senate can't even muster the 60 votes needed to pass a climate bill, then it won't be able to muster the 67 votes needed to ratify a treaty.
And their concerns, the Republican concern, is the economic impact in the US as a result of this bill. This is a bill looking at a 20% cut in CO2 emissions from smokestacks in the US. What is likely to be the economic impact of that?
Well, different studies arrive at very different conclusions, but the Heritage Foundation, for example, did an assessment of the Waxman-Markey bill, which is a little more lenient than the Senate bill. It only has a 17% emission reduction target, and concluded that between the years 2012 and 2030, there would be a $9.6 trillion loss in cumulative GDP, gross domestic product, with job losses of roughly 1 million a year over that period. So a lot of people in the United States wonder whether we have more to fear from climate legislation and climate policy than we do from climate change itself. I'm one of those people who is quite alarmist about climate policy, although not about climate change.
Well, you know,
our
we were supposed
our economy
to have,
runs on fossil energy.
We were supposed to have a Greenpeace campaigner appearing on this program, and she pulled out because, specifically because she was going to have someone from your institute, you, in fact, appearing on the program, because she says the problem is that industries like the fuel industry have absolutely no interest in protecting the climate. I mean, what do you say to that argument?
Well, I say that there are a lot of electric utilities, for example, and other companies that are aggressively lobbying for this climate legislation, what I would call energy rationing, because for every energy-intensive company that would be hammered by this kind of policy, there are companies that I would call energy rationing profiteers that hope to make windfall profits on the basis of these energy restrictions. So for her to pretend that she is somehow pure as regards to business interests, or her side is pure, is ridiculous. That's a child's oversimplification of this debate. There are idealists. I would consider myself one on both sides. There are economic interests on both sides.
OK, Nick, one of the things that happened at the Barcelona talks is that the African delegation walked out because they said richer countries weren't prepared to do more. Do industrialised nations lay themselves open to accusations that they're only thinking of the profit margin, not the environment?
Well, I think we've had a lot of broken promises towards the developing countries over many years on what the developed world was actually going to do. And you know, there's every expectation that when a climate deal in fact does come through, that continents like Africa will actually get some investment in their development and in their adaptation to the climate change challenge. I mean, certainly Africa is only a few percentage points in terms of global emissions, and yet, you know, it is a continent that's already very extreme in terms of its weather variations. It suffers already from extreme droughts and extreme floods. That's nothing to do with climate change. That's a natural thing. But we're already seeing a more intensification of that process, and Africa is very fearful that indeed it will suffer from more intense floods, more intense droughts, problems with crop production. And so they're looking for, in a sense, a recompense. But it's not just about recompense. I mean, if we get a good deal in Copenhagen, one of that deal will be paying developing countries for not chopping down their trees. And you know, if you look at the vast forests of the Democratic Republic of Congo, they are soaking up emissions day in, day out. And that would seem that we're actually paying them for a global service they provide rather than handouts, as some people would describe them. Can I just get back to what your my colleague in Washington is discussing? I mean, perhaps our departure really would be on the issue of the economics. I mean, if America doesn't, in a sense, join in the climate change challenge, there's also, you know, potential losses for the US economy. If you look at a country like China, for example, its growth in wind power is 100% year on year. They expect to be generating something like 10% of their energy from renewables next year. You look at Germany, they're saying that by 2020 they'll have more people employed in clean tech than in the sort of older industries, including the car industry.
What do you say to Marlowe's specific accusation that there is a lot of needless alarmism over the whole climate situation?
Well, you know, I look at what the scientific community says, and there are still some people who who don't accept the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 2,000 scientists chosen from around the world by their own governments to actually look at this phenomenon of global warming and look at the economic impacts as well. I mean, they're quite clear. I mean, the head of the IPCC said just only the other day that he believes unless emissions peak in 2015, we're in serious trouble. You look at Lord Stern for the UK Treasury, we know his figures, 5% of GDP could be lost as a result of climate change, perhaps as high as 20%. Now, you know, you can play around with these numbers, but there is, I believe, and so do many other people, a growing consensus that there actually are losses to be had if we stick with the present economic model. And let's just remember that only now we're in a world where more people are employed in renewable energy than are actually employed in the fossil fuel industry. So who is actually the one that's going to win or lose in this debate?
Marlo, what do you say to that? The future of investment lies in more sustainable energy, alternative fuels and such like.
Well, the idea that we have to somehow restrict our own energy use in order to prosper in clean tech industries is actually refuted by China's example. China does not have a cap on its emissions, yet China is exporting all kinds of solar voltaic panels, wind turbines, and so on. So this notion that we have to somehow shoot ourselves in the foot economically in order to enjoy the alleged benefits of clean tech, I think is untrue. Also, one of the things I think that Nick overlooks when he mentions Germany, Germany has actually subsidized solar voltaic electricity to the tune of $72 billion. Well, actually, it will be $72 billion by the year 2010, just since 2000. So 10 years, $72 billion investment. They have actually, what do they get out of it? 0.6%, 0.6% of their electricity comes from solar voltaics. This is really not the future. This is the past. 100% of the world's energy was renewable in the 19th century. So I think Nick is off base on several points. Also, the IPCC, he discussed it as if somehow it represented the consensus of 2,000 scientists. No, what the IPCC does is a literature survey. It's a review of the work of 2,000 scientists, but not all 2,000 of those scientists sign off on every jot and tittle in the UN IPCC report. The big scientific issue, as far as I am concerned, is climate sensitivity. How reactive is the climate to increases in greenhouse gas emissions? The IPCC uses models which make assumptions about that. The only empirical study that I know of that's actually gone out and tried to test it was Richard Lindzen's study, a recent study published in Geophysical Research Letters. Richard Lindzen is a professor at MIT, and he used satellites to measure outgoing long-wave radiation and reflected solar radiation in the atmosphere as a response to changes in sea surface temperatures. All the IPCC models projected a decrease, in other words, that the atmosphere would retain more of this heat as the oceans warmed
gentlemen,
up. Lindzen's satellite study showed the reverse.
Let's agree that research can be used on both sides to reach conclusions that both sides want the research to reach.
Let's not agree on that. Let's not agree on that. Let's not agree on that.
Well, I agree.
You know, the IPCC, just 1 second, Marlo, you've had your moment. The IPCC was founded in the late 1980s by UNEP and the World Meteorological Organization at a time when the issue of climate change as an unfolding phenomena was occurring. People weren't quite sure what was going on. The IPCC has spent something like 20 years, as Marlo says, peer-reviewing the peer-reviewed science. And those papers that they produced in 2007 put a clear full stop behind the question of whether climate change is happening. Now, whether Marlo wants to refer to a paper from a scientist, no doubt a respected scientist from MIT, is fine. But basically, we can all find isolated papers or a paper that proves this or disproves
Marlo,
that.
Nick is
the
right.
IPCC was about the process of
There are scientists
consensus.
who do say global warming has no impact on the environment, but the overwhelming evidence is that global warming does have an impact. And in any case, developing nations are extremely worried about the environmental disasters they've been suffering, the typhoons, the storms, the flooding. These countries are saying unless richer countries take action, they risk total destruction.
Now, actually, I think it's more correct to say that unless these developing countries grow, they face all the same kinds of problems they already do. I mean, the reason why people worry about climate change is that it supposedly will exacerbate, will aggravate a host of existing conditions which already threaten health and welfare, like malaria. But, you know, if you look at the Kyoto Protocol, for example, the world's nations could spend $165 billion a year complying with Kyoto from now to the year 2100. And according to the IPCC's own models, that would reduce malaria incidence by about 0.2%. Okay? But if we spent $3 billion a year on proven methods to combat malaria, we could cut malaria death rates in half. And so what I'm suggesting is that the Kyoto road is the road to ruin because it is sucking more and more of our resources, including expertise like Nick's, into an area of activity which produces so little bang, so little health and welfare bang for our buck.
Nick, is Marlo right? Resources are being ploughed into the wrong avenues. We could do more for health and social welfare if we looked at different priorities.
Well, I mean, the IPCC came up with the conclusion that, you know, we need an investment of less than 0.1% of GDP per year to actually deal with climate change every year for the next 20 or 30 years. Lord Stern comes up with quite low figures as well. I mean, you know, again, Marlo can select his economics. I would turn to someone like Lord Stern or the IPCC, who seem to think it won't cost as much. And often with these environmental agreements, you know, you find actually people put very high figures on how much it's going to cost, and then when they actually do it, they actually find that the costs are indeed much lower, and you get multiple benefits. Let's remember, the burning of fossil fuels isn't just causing climate change. There's something like 1.8 million deaths a year linked with air pollution, linked with the burning of fossil fuels. And let's get back to the other factors too. I mean, peak oil, we could debate that for a long time, but a lot of oil companies seem to indicate that, you know, they're finding less and less oil when they go out there. There's energy security issues. There's a multiple of issues that can be dealt with by going to a low carbon society, not least, as we mentioned before, jobs, and also moving to a clean tech industry. So I think when we start looking at the economics, and I think if, you know, the thing about the UN Climate Convention is that it actually has quite a lot of market mechanisms in there. I mean, Marlo referred to the German government before, but I mean, one thing they brought in was a feed-in tariff, which was not actually meant to be a subsidy as he characterized it, but a way of unleashing the market to actually invest in renewable energy. So there are market mechanisms you can use, not just, as Marlo suggests, you know, just spending lots of money.
Well, then why hasn't Kyoto been more successful then? There doesn't seem to have been a lot achieved since Kyoto came into force.
You know, well, Kyoto has been around a relatively...
To one point that Nick made
there.
Yes,
come Marlo.
Okay, that Nick, I'm not sure about the 1.8 million deaths from fossil energy air pollution, but I do know that at least 1 million women and children die every year because of indoor air pollution, because they do not have access to fossil energy. And so their main energy source is wood chopped from the forest and burned indoors in poorly ventilated huts. And this is something that is killing people right now. It also leads to terrible eye diseases. And a coal-fired power plant, for example, in a country like Kenya, would do wonders for people's health and welfare. I mean, for one thing, women could stop spending their days carrying wood from the forest. They could actually devote themselves to more interesting and less back-breaking pursuits. The forests would be spared because you wouldn't have to continually chop more and more trees down just to heat your home and cook your food.
Do you think there's a middle path, Marlo? Because clearly there are concerns on both sides.
Of fossil energy that are just gigantic, that are being overlooked.
Is there a way of achieving a middle class?
Marlo, you're in a difficult spot there because I actually live in Kenya, and that's where UNEP is headquartered. And what's fascinating about Kenya is it's actually looking at its natural fuels rather than fossil fuels. It doesn't have coal, it doesn't have oil and gas as we speak right now, but it does have solar, it has geothermal, and it has wind. And as we speak, the largest wind farm in Africa is going in, courtesy of a Dutch consortium, 300 megawatts in Turkana, the poorest area of Kenya. And, you know, something like only 10% of Kenyans have access to grid electricity. This is going to be delivering electricity to the poor areas super fast. They don't have to worry about a grid. And also now they're putting in wind turbines in the Ngong Hills, not far from my office, 50 megawatts there. They're going the renewable route.
Okay,
and they're
gentlemen,
finding that actually it pays great returns.
You obviously don't need me here because you're talking about the issues really well there. But let me just change direction slightly and talk about what developing countries are expected to do. Todd Stern, President Obama's top climate negotiator, criticised some developing nations for not acting over global warming. He said what is not helpful is the way some developing countries focus more on citing chapter and verse of dubious interpretations designed to prove that they don't have any responsibility for action now, rather than thinking through pragmatic ways to find common ground to start solving the problem. Nick, are developing countries, China, India, Brazil, are they deliberately avoiding action?
Climate change is linked with the emissions of fossil fuels, and CO2 can stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, if not millennia. And so the lion's share of the emissions in the atmosphere right now, which are triggering climate change, are actually the responsibility of the industrialized nations. And until the industrialized nations deliver on their pledges, their promises, and so on and so forth, then developing economies like China and India are going to say, forget it, until you actually do something serious. You know, it's difficult for us to follow.
Marlo, I know that there's pressure on China particularly to invest more in carbon capturing technology, which apparently catches CO2 and stores it underground. And there's pressure on the US to help China invest in that. Is that right, do you think?
Well, you have to understand that carbon capture and sequestration on an industrial scale is at least 10 to 20 years off here in the United States. So I think it's kind of ridiculous to insist that China somehow invest all this money in something that hasn't been commercially proven in the world's richest country. Let me just make one big point, though, on the developing countries and this climate treaty, which is that the goal of this climate treaty would be to stabilize atmospheric concentrations of CO2 at 450 parts per million by the year 2050. Or to put that in other terms, the whole world would somehow have to reduce its emissions 50% below current levels by 2050. There is no way to do that unless the developing countries make heroic sacrifices, which I would call commit economic suicide. For example, the only way that we could get there would be if developing countries basically keep their per capita CO2 emissions flat between now and 2050. That's roughly what it would require. And that is just unreasonable. And what I think is the great shame is that the developing countries are setting themselves up to have to commit economic suicide because they are the biggest proponents now of climate alarm.
Okay.
They're the ones who are saying that we have to cut our emissions 40% because the world is going to come to an end. But the goal that they're looking at is impossible to achieve unless they cut their emissions.
Nick,
and so they're painting themselves into a corner that will only hurt them.
Nick, I know that the UN's top climate official has said it's probably impossible to conclude a comprehensive treaty at Copenhagen. Very briefly, what's the best you think we can hope for?
I think we can hope for a lot more than some of the reports in the last few days. I think we can see a deal on forests. I think we can see some money on the table now for developing countries to adapt to climate change. We'll be seeing leadership from the European Union with their targets, and you're seeing some developing countries now setting their own voluntary emission reduction targets like Mexico and like others. So, you know, if we don't plan the future in Copenhagen, then the future will plan itself. And I don't think it's a particularly pleasant looking future if we don't deal with climate change soon.
Gentlemen, it's been a very interesting and lively discussion. Thank you so much for contributing, Nick Nuttall and Marlo Lewis. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. Do email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But for the moment, from me, Shiulie Ghosh, bye-bye for now.